Hi, welcome to another batch of classic bookmarks. A couple of years ago, we realized that we had been producing Bookmark for 30 years, some 425 episodes. To celebrate, we chose 15 shows to enhance and broadcast. The reception has been terrific. Viewers got a real kick out of seeing or re-seeing the conversations with Toni Morrison, Ray Bradbury, William Styron, Alexander McCall Smith, and many others. So, we have chosen another 15 shows from the archives. Interviews with George Saunders, Margaret Atwood, E.O. Wilson, Walter Mosley, Albert Murray, James Haskins, and 9 others. Of course, we are continuing to produce new shows with new writers and old writer friends. But in the meantime, we hope you enjoy watching these classics as much as we enjoyed making them. In 3 volumes of poetry, Natasha Tretheway has joined the historical and the personal. She writes of Black Union Army soldiers, the mulatto brothels of Storyville, and her own mother and father. I spoke with Natasha Tretheway at On the Brink, the annual conference for writers and readers at Jacksonville State University. Well, Natasha, I have been to readings of yours, I think now for 5 or 6 years. I've heard you read, I'm sure, half a dozen times.
That's right.
Always enjoyed it and have been looking forward to this.
Well, I'm so delighted to be finally doing this with you too. This is great.
And there was a question, and now I do know the answer to this question like a good lawyer, but for years I did not. Why are you named Natasha?
I'm named Natasha because my father was reading War and Peace when I was born.
It had to be, didn't it? I mean,
it did, but a lot of people ask me that, and some people assume that I was named after the Natasha from the Rocky and Bullwinkle show. Do you remember the cartoon Russian Natasha? Yeah.
Yes. You are now, of course, professing and teaching at Emory, but it's been a road to get there. Your life, your autobiography is so central to your work, to your poetry, that it's impossible to talk about your poems without talking about your life. So in a sort of general sense, you started out as a Mississippian.
That's right. I was born there in 1966 and lived there for a little bit before my parents moved to Canada for about a year. My father was in the Canadian Navy, and so we moved there for a year and then returned to the States. And I grew up in Mississippi for the first 6 or 7 years of my life, and then moved to Georgia and grew up there, and then graduate school farther north in Virginia at Hollins, where my father's a professor, and then even farther to the University of Massachusetts. And then the first time I came back south was to hold my first academic position at Auburn University.
That was your first job?
That was my first job.
Oh, what a nice place to start.
Yeah, it was a lovely place to start.
Your father was a Canadian. Mm-hmm. Your mother was a Mississippian.
Right.
How did they meet?
They met at Kentucky State College, which is one of the historically all-black colleges and universities. My father, coming from Canada, they were both very young when they went to college, 16, and my father was coming from Canada, and he's white. He looked at a guide to American colleges and universities to find one that he could afford, and didn't quite realize that it was a black college when they let him in, and he got a track scholarship. And he hitchhiked all the way down, except for through New York City. He saved enough money to take a bus through New York, but he hitchhiked the rest of the way, and he met my mother at Kentucky State. My mother's story about it is that it was the night that the Righteous Brothers were going to be on the Ed Sullivan Show, I think, and all the women in her dormitory thought the Righteous Brothers were black because of their voices. And so they gathered around the TV to watch the Righteous Brothers, and at the same moment that these white singers came on, my father went jogging by And my mother says it was love at first sight.
Wait, your father went to a mostly black school, not
He
knowing
did.
it was going to be a mostly black school.
That's right.
All these young women got together to watch what they thought was going to be a black group, who turned out to be a white group.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's wonderful, isn't it?
It's sort of serendipitous that they met and fell in love. But they couldn't be married there. And they couldn't be married in Mississippi either at the time, so they had to go to Ohio to get married.
Up to Cincinnati.
That's right.
It's positively Uncle Tom's Cabin to go to Cincinnati.
And then from there to Canada.
Right. But only for a year. And then there was, half dozen years where your mother and your father and you had to be in Mississippi.
That's right.
We'll return to that because you've written about it so many times. Your first book won the prize, the Kawe-Kunim Prize, which translates as
Beware of the Dog?
Beware of the Dog. Now my question is, why would a poetry prize be named Beware of the Dog?
Well, I know a little bit about the story about how it was named.
I'm
Toy
sure you do.
Derricott told me that she and maybe Cornelius was there too. They were in Italy for some kind of workshop, and they were walking through the streets, and someone had that little symbol on the front of their door, and they didn't know what it meant, but they were really drawn to it, and then they found out what it meant, and it seemed important to them at the time, I think, because maybe what they were trying to bring out was the wealth of writing being done by young African-American writers across the country who had different stories to tell.
Well,
and then I went to Georgia, so it's appropriate that I won also the first time.
Because
I was a dog, right?
Yeah. Oh, well, that's terrible, but we'll just leave it. You have a stepmother, and in poems you have a stepfather. Mm-hmm. When did your parents divorce?
My parents divorced when I was in the first grade, when I was 6 years old, and so my mother and I left Mississippi. My father was at Tulane in New Orleans. They had been commuting back and forth between Mississippi and Louisiana, and that's when we left. My mother started graduate school in Atlanta, and I came with her.
You lived with your mother, but you must have maintained I understand, a solid and warm relationship with your dad.
I saw him every summer. I spent the whole 3 months of the summer with my grandmother in Gulfport, and my father would come over several times and take me back to New Orleans for a couple of weeks.
Yeah. New Orleans important to you?
It is.
Yeah, that's not a name. Well, of course it is. It's in the Belloc, isn't it? Of course it is. What do you? I know this sounds like a side street, but I'm always curious about what people think about the flood and FEMA. This is, tell me what's your emotional rush now when you think about New Orleans, the city that got forgot?
I'm still struck by how difficult all the imagery was of the people who were losing their homes and their livelihoods. And I think one of the worst things about it has everything to do with language, and that was when the people were called refugees rather than evacuees. That there was a way that we forgot that they were American citizens. And the same language was used during the Great Flood in the 20s, I guess in 1927. And it's my brother still lives in Gulfport, and I went back for the first time last May. And it was really hard to drive around, and not know where I was, because so often you don't pay attention to street signs, you just pay attention to those landmarks, those things on the landscape that tell you where you are, and they weren't there. And it felt like this place that I had been writing about and elegizing in many ways. I was doing that, and it wasn't gone when I was doing it. And then all of a sudden, it really was gone.
It was wiped clean, a lot of it. It's just amazing. I mean, it is what unbelievable means. You say, I see it, but I don't believe it. Mm-hmm. Your first book is, now this, tell me if you think this is odd, but I thought of Robert Frost in a way. You're not a white man from Vermont, but
I have a sense of place.
Work. I thought of Work.
Work.
I thought of the many, many Frost poems that have to do with honest and not always clean and neat work. Right. Your poems are about people doing their jobs.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I don't think I set out to write about work at first. I think what I wanted to do was something sappier than that, which is to write about the life of my maternal grandmother, because she means a lot to me, and I just thought, well, she's great, I should write poems about it. And when I started doing that, I had to listen again to the stories that she had told me all her life. And all of her stories, I realized, had to do with work. And so that's what I knew about who she was, and that it was always defined by the work that she did. She was always striving for something else in her life. And it seemed like that was an honest way to think about who any of us are.
Yeah. A lot of people in this world, their lives are defined by their hands and their backs.
That's right.
One of the things that caught my eye was the reference to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, the fire in New York,
Right.
where those workers are caught in their particular Holocaust, being read about in Mississippi.
I imagined when I was doing some of the research for Belloc's Ophelia and looking at, and dates became important to me when I was first working on domestic work, because not only was the work that my grandmother did important for defining her, but I think it also helped to define a historical moment. Her kind of work, her opportunities were very much rooted to what was going on in the political and social culture of the time. So when I was doing research for Belloc's Ophelia, I was trying to figure out what was going on around the country. And I imagined Ophelia as the kind of character who would read newspapers. I mean, because she wanted to make herself better, she believed that the way to do that was to read and to be knowledgeable. And I imagined that that would be the kind of thing that she would have found out by reading a newspaper, and to make that connection between the way that she feels trapped in her house and in the work that she's doing.
I want to talk about Belloc, the photographer, and that volume. But before we even do that, volume 2 is of a piece, mostly. I mean, there are bits that aren't exactly Ophelia, but that's all right. And then volume 3 is again heavily thematically controlled, the ship island and so on. Tell me what you think is the advantage, the merit of a volume of poetry that is coherent, cohesive. I mean, you seem to want to do that.
I think
very
it's
willfully, in fact,
very
with the
willfully.
Belloc especially.
Well, I think it's with the Belloc, I was interested in that historical character, or the imagined historical character that she was. With Native Guard, I think I was more interested in the idea of memory and historical erasure and historical amnesia, and the responsibility of any of us to keep memory alive. And so it was history itself that I wanted to question and to explore. And for me, that kind of cohesive collection just works with the way I think. I like asking myself a question and thinking about it for many years, and doing research and finding answers to it in all sorts of unexpected places. It keeps me sort of focused on something for a good period of time, and I can read eclectically, but always somehow some part of my mind is working back to answering that question.
Well, some poet might sit down and write a poem and then another poem and end up with 35 poems, then publish a book of poems. But that's not what you do. You seem to like a book of poems that is thematically connected and coherent. What do you think the advantages of that are for you?
Well, for me, it's a way to have some focus. I like to give myself a question, something that I'm obsessed with, that I'm interested in trying to figure out. I'd like to think that even those poets who are sitting down and writing one poem at a time are still obsessed with something, that each of those poems is working out. But mine is a little bit more willful on the outside, because I'm doing research, I'm reading eclectically, so that that question is always in the back of my mind and perhaps being answered by what I'm reading and studying while trying to work on a collection.
Your first book is thematically coherent in the sense that it's about your grandmother, and it's about work, and it's about being a working woman, black woman in Mississippi. But the second book, Belloc's Ophelia, is really organized. Who was Mr. Belloc?
Well, E.J. Belloc was a commercial photographer in New Orleans. He took photographs of the shipyards, but he also took a lot of photographs of women in the red light district in Storyville. A lot of art historians think that it was just sort of a hobby that he did, that he just enjoyed taking photographs. He had big collections of photography books, and I think that he also, it was discovered later on, took pictures of the Chinese opium dens, but none of those photographs have survived. So he seemed to have a little bit of a documentary edge as well, and his photographs suggest that. There are plenty that just seem like they might have been made for the blue books or personal portraits, but others seem to suggest a kind of documentary edge to them.
And he was fascinated by the working girls in these different houses, but apparently especially focused on the houses in which all the girls were light-skinned, but not Caucasian. They were some variety of exotic, and I mean, they weren't passing as white. These were houses in which black girls who were very light-skinned were the specialty of the place, and
right,
he liked
the
that
octoroon
especially.
Houses. People have figured out that he was doing work in the octoroon houses, particularly Lula White's mansion, because of the wallpaper that appeared in the backdrop of many of the photographs. There was this velvet flocked wallpaper, and that's how people were able to identify not only that the women were prostitutes, but that they were being taken photographs of in Lula White's house. And so when you see the pictures, you might think that they were white women, but the way that people know that they're not is something, another kind of mask or covering in that wallpaper.
And your heroine, is that the right word?
Yeah.
Your heroine, Ophelia, is a young woman who goes to New Orleans to get a respectable job. She would be a retail clerk if she had her way.
That's right. She would. If there were more opportunities for women at all to be retail clerks, that's what she would have done. But at that time, they were still hiring young men more to do that.
And alas.
And alas, she finds herself answering an invitation that a madam had made to her to come and live in her house. And a couple of those houses on Basin Street were very elegant, and they were places that if you had to go somewhere, you would have indoor plumbing and good food, and it would be clean, and so she ultimately has to go there when there's no other choice.
Yeah. How many of those poems are letters, would you say?
I think that they're probably, half of them. The book's kind of divided into halves. All the letters that she writes home to her former school teacher, and then the diary that she keeps over the same period of time. So they kind of tell the same story, but one of them is a story that's meant for an audience, the teacher, and the other is the private reflections that we keep in a diary.
It's touching, the early letters to the teacher, where she says, "I know you'll be horrified to learn that I've become a prostitute in New Orleans." I wish there were letters back.
You know, I thought about that, about what the teacher would say, and ultimately I decided to try to imply what kind of answer she was getting by the letters that she wrote. But I think she's the kind of woman who, before she ended up in New Orleans, really wanted a better life. She admired the teacher. She wanted to have the same kind of opportunities to make herself like that. And a lot of what I learned in doing research to make Ophelia a character was from the diary of a woman nicknamed Mamie. Ruth Rosen published her letters. They're held at Harvard, at Radcliffe at the library, but Mamie was a Jewish prostitute, the same time living in Philadelphia, and she very much wanted clean living, and she had ended up being a store clerk in Philadelphia, which apparently in the cities was one of the first tracks for young women getting into prostitution. She had to quit school because her father died, but for Ophelia, public education for anybody in the state of Alabama or Mississippi at that time was, up until ninth grade, white or black. If you were going to public school, it ended for everybody.
Well, she's fully literate.
Yes.
She is a poet.
Well,
She's a writer.
she kept going to school. She kept showing up at the classroom, even though it was for children, and borrowing books from the teacher.
Well, your newest book is, again, historically based and again, thematically unified. Takes place mostly on Ship Island off the coast of Louisiana, where there was this now almost forgotten black regiment of guards who guarded, if I'm right, Confederate prisoners. What took you there? That's not something that you could have had a long interest in. It's just an oddity.
Well, I should say it's right off the coast of Gulfport, Mississippi, which is my hometown. And I used to go out to Ship Island every year on the 4th of July and tour the fort. It's a barrier island, so the water is lovely out there as opposed to the sort of the coastal waters right there. So I used to go out there every year and tour the fort, and there was never any mention of these black troops when the park ranger gave the tour. And one day, when I started working at Auburn, I wanted to go home on the weekends and take my grandmother out to dinner. So we went out to dinner at a restaurant on the beach, and I was talking to her about teaching my class, my creative writing class. And you probably know this assignment that people give to students to write about the time where one of their relatives met someone famous. And I was telling my grandmother about this, and because I remembered her story about her brother meeting Al Capone. Her brother was a bellhop at a hotel on the beach, and back then Al Capone used to use the fort at Ship Island for a casino. So we had gambling going on out there. And so this was a story that was part of our family legend. And at some point, there was a woman who stood up. She was sitting near us. She'd been eavesdropping the whole time. And it was a white woman. And she leaned over to me before she left, and she said, "I think there's something else you need to know about Ship Island." And she told me about the black soldiers. And I was so excited. The minute I dropped my grandmother off, I went straight back to the Gulfport Public Library and searched until I found a mention of the Native Guards in someone's MA thesis. And at that moment, I was hooked. I wanted to know why I didn't know that history.
You've written several poems about the unearthing, the resurrecting of forgotten chunks of American history. Mm-hmm. Those chunks very often that have to do with black soldiers or black workers. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no easy answer to this, but are things getting better? Are we getting there?
Oh yes, I think we are telling those stories a lot more. I mean, Mississippi is telling all kinds of stories that have been buried for a long time. And even in the past few years since I've been doing work with the Native Guards, their story is much more a part of what happens on the island now. And so I think that if we tell the stories, there are people who are willing to hear them, and they become part of our larger American story. And that's what I've been wanting to do. I don't want to bury or subjugate another story, but I want a fuller version of all of our stories.
Yeah, it's interesting to me reading through your 3 volumes that on the one hand, it's intensely personal. It's you and your mother and your father and your grandmother. On the other hand, almost alternatively, it is historical. It is somebody you don't know and somebody who has been forgotten. Mm-hmm. Would you read a couple of poems for me, please?
I'd be happy to. This is Vignette from a photograph by E.J. Belloc, circa 1912. They pose the portrait outside the brothel, Belloc's black scrim, a chair for her to sit on. She wears white, a rhinestone choker, fur, her dark crown of hair. An elegant image, one she might send to her mother. Perhaps the others crowd in behind Belloc, awaiting their turns, tremors of laughter in their white throats. Maybe Belloc chats just a little to put her at ease while he waits for the right moment, a look on her face to keep in a gilded frame the ornate box he'll put her in. Suppose he tells her about a circus coming to town, monkeys and organ music, the high trapeze, but then she's no longer listening. She's forgotten he's there, Instead, she must be thinking of her childhood wonder at seeing the contortionist in a sideshow, how he could make himself small, fit into cramped spaces, his lungs barely expanding with each tiny breath. My parents broke 2 laws of Mississippi. They went to Ohio to marry, returned to Mississippi. They crossed the river into Cincinnati, a city whose name begins with a sound like sin, the sound of wrong, miss in Mississippi. A year later, they moved to Canada, followed a route the same as slaves, the train slicing the white glaze of winter, leaving Mississippi. Faulkner's Joe Christmas was born in winter, like Jesus, given his name for the day he was left at the orphanage, his race unknown in Mississippi. My father was reading War and Peace when he gave me my name. I was born near Easter, 1966, in Mississippi. When I turned 33, my father said, "It's your Jesus year. You're the same age he was when he died. It was spring, the hills green in Mississippi." I know more than Joe Christmas did. Natasha is a Russian name, though I'm not. It means Christmas child, even in Mississippi.
Thank you very much. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you.